This
Unfortunately, we
conference will
can't.
now be recorded.
Sorry about that, Mike. Go
Unfortunately, we
on.
can't be in Shofuso today, but I do encourage everyone who can make it, come on down. It's only about 40 minutes from the Mercer County Library, so it's not too far of a drive. And really, the information that we'll be sharing today is really heightened when you're there. I mean, it's interesting information to give you the background of Shofuso, but I really think you should come and experience it for yourself at some point if you can. It's a beautiful time of year right now. It's spring. The azalea bushes are out. There's lots of beautiful flowers happening at Shofuso, but our gardens are really designed to be beautiful all year round. So if you can't make it this spring, come in the summer, the winter, the fall, anytime that works for you, we'll be there. But I want to give you as much information as I can on this medium here in a slideshow. I'll try to make it as fun and interesting and engaging as possible. As we said, put your questions in the chat as they come, and we'll answer them at the end. I'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I'll talk for about 40 minutes if I can keep my timing right. But there's a lot of information about this place. It's a beautiful gem in the middle of Philadelphia in Fairmount Park. Shofuso is a Japanese house and garden that has been in Philadelphia for quite a long time, and there's a really interesting history and how it got here. So let's just dive right in. Um, Here's a picture of Shofuso. For those who've never been here, I want to show you a picture that is sort of encapsulating the full scope of the garden and the house. It's hard in these presentations to give you an orientation of how we're going to be walking through the space. So I wanted to put this in here just so you can kind of get a view of what we're looking at from the outside. You can see people in the picture there visiting the site. They're walking around the space. It's a 1.2 acre garden. It's pretty small. A lot of people come in, they expect it's a big strolling garden like Longwood Gardens or something like that. It's a bit different. It's a very laser focused on Japanese gardening, Japanese architecture, and specifically designed and built after a specific home in Japan that I'll get to in a little bit. But just know that the house sits on about half of that acreage, about zero point 0.6 acres, and the other half is the pond and the gardens surrounding it. And the garden path sort of leads around it in a big circle, just to kind of give you a lay of the land. But let's talk about what Shofuso is, where it came from, how it got here, sort of just what it is. And for those who don't know, hopefully some of you have been to Shofuso, and maybe this is some maybe old information for you. But for those who are new, I'm just going to start from the beginning and give you a bit of the history about Shofuso and where it came from. So we got to go all the way back. Let's get in our time machines here to 1876, and we were just talking about the 250th anniversary. I think I'm going to say this right, the semi-quincentennial of America coming up on in 2026. Well, in 1876, here in Philadelphia, we had the World's Fair. Of course, part of the reason we had it, I think the main reason we had the World's Fair in 1876 was because it was the centennial, the 100th year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of America. And for those who are unfamiliar with the World's Fair, it was essentially the biggest gathering of countries from across the world to showcase their new inventions, new technology, culture, art, lots of different things before the internet existed and before we had phones. The World's Fair was that. And a lot of amazing things were showcased for the first time at the World's Fair, including this one in 1876. But the reason I'm talking about it today is because this was the second World's Fair that the Japanese the country of Japan had a display, had an exhibition at the World's Fair. The first one they were at was in Paris in 1874, I believe. Before that, Japan was closed off to the outside world almost completely. They did not trade with the outside world except for a couple of tradesmen from the Netherlands in Nagasaki, and that was it. They did not travel outside of Japan. They didn't let tourists into Japan until the mid 1850s, when Commodore Perry, an admiral in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, took a bunch of gunships to Japan and sort of forcibly opened their borders to trade. But the Japanese were quick to sort of reinvent themselves, and they traveled the world. They sent a delegation of samurai diplomats to the U.S., to Philadelphia, to Boston, to New York, to D.C., to sort of start the process of opening up to the world and being a part of the world trade and just kind of be on the world stage. And a huge part of that is being part of the World's Fair. So Going back to the World's Fair in 1876 here in Philadelphia, this is the first time many people in America, I would say more than half of the people at this World's Fair, had ever seen anything Japanese before. We see in this picture a beautiful structure they built, the Japanese Bazaar. You can see at the bottom in the inscription there. They also built a garden. They brought animals. They sold pottery and some arts and crafts, some knickknacks you could buy there in this beautiful building that we see illustrated in this picture. But back in 1876, cameras did exist, so we have a picture of that World's Fair display. And this is the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is exactly where Shofuso sits today. Um, Unfortunately, after the World's Fair was over, nothing was really upkept. Nothing was maintained very well. The city of Philadelphia didn't have a lot of money, I guess, to maintain the space. There's only 4 structures that still exist from the World's Fair. One of them is the Police Touch Museum, which was the headquarters, at that time known as Memorial Hall, was the headquarters of the World's Fair. And we see in this picture the bazaar that is no longer there. The only thing that remains of this display that we see in this picture is actually this lantern, which I could zoom in here, but I can't. Right in the foreground of this picture, at the sort of the edge of this triangle, is a lantern that we do still have in the park. It's sort of hidden away. If you go to Shofuso, you can ask about it, and we'll tell you where it is. It's a nice little hidden gem off in sort of the woods that we still have around. But nothing really is maintained or still, I should say, exists from that World's Fair display, including the gardens, the structures. It's theorized that they were knocked over by a hurricane in the late 1800s, all these buildings that were here. So by the early 1900s, really nothing was left of the World's Fair besides the big Memorial Hall that was sort of in disrepair at that time, and 2 bathrooms and the Ohio House that still exists. So not a whole lot left to celebrate this momentous World's Fair. It was the biggest World's Fair, or I should say the most well attended World's Fair at the time. And yeah, nothing really was maintained and upkept after that, unfortunately. But it was the sort of source of many people's love of Japanese culture, including 2 very rich Philadelphians who, in the early 1900s, remembered this World's Fair fondly, and they wanted to carry on that legacy of the importance, the sort of the foundation or the birthplace of U.S. Japan relations. They didn't want that history to get lost, so they did something kind of crazy. They bought this temple gate from Japan. This is the Neomon Temple Gate. It was an actual gate. You can see in this picture you could walk through. That's what it was for a Buddhist temple, I believe outside of Kyoto. And this temple gate was built in the early 1300s. This thing is very old. And it was brought from Japan to the U.S. because these rich Philadelphians wanted something to be placed here in this important part of the park that at this time was just a flat, normal part of the park with grass and trees, nothing really there to tell people that, hey, this history is here and it's very important and we should be talking about it. Thankfully, those people had enough money to put this together, and they love Japanese culture and Japanese art. Here's another picture of the garden from the other side. You can really see they did a pretty good job in creating a nice space for Japanese art and culture to be revered and showcased to people in America. At this time in the early 1900s, it didn't really happen yet when this was placed here in 1908, but Madame Butterfly was a really big musical that many people fell in love with, especially the rich people in America. So you see a lot of Japanese gardens in the early 1920s or so being built. Morris Arboretum is a good example of one, and this one as well. But this is an amazing Japanese garden that the reason I'm talking about it again is because this is also right where Shofuso sits today. Maybe asking what happened to it and why it's not there anymore. Unfortunately, in 1955, this Buddhist temple gate, the Neomon Temple Gate, burnt down. We're not really sure what happened. There's no real records. It happened overnight. Um, it was being renovated at the time, so there were flammable things around, and we're assuming someone like flicked a cigarette or something. Maybe it was malicious. We don't know, but it was burnt down overnight. There's nothing that anyone could do about it, and it left just a flat, again, an empty part of the park with nothing really in it except for not even trees. Everything burnt down around it. It was sort of a depressing area to be in after that fire. But of course, we know Shofuso was brought to this part of the park about a year later in 1956, and it was opened to the public in 1958. But we're sort of missing a key part to this story. Well, what is Shofuso? Where did it come from, and why was it built in the first place? And that's a great question. The origins of Shofuso go back a little bit more recently in history to the early 1950s, and specifically to the Museum of Modern Art and to an architect named Junzo Yoshimura, a very famous, at least in Japan, architect for modern architecture at the time. Was part of the modernist movement, and really was perfect for this job. He was born in Japan, spent a lot of time, however, in America, and before the start of World War II, went back to Japan. And he, along with a bunch of curators at the MoMA, traveled around Japan to study Japanese architecture, specifically Japanese architecture from the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, because at the time the MoMA had just completed their courtyard, what is now their sculpture garden, but was just an outdoor space that they had just completed and just bought the property for, and needed something to put there. So they put first thing they showcased there was two European style modernist architect homes. And after that second home was displayed, they said, let's go to Japan and see what we can showcase from Japanese architecture. They wanted to showcase modern architecture, but while they were there, they sort of fell in love with a more refined, elegant style of architecture that is from the 1600s called Shoin Zukuri style, which is by many considered the highest form, the most concentrated, condensed, but beautiful form of Japanese architecture throughout history, popularized from the early 1600s to the mid 1600s. It was where all the nobility, upper echelon, uh, wealthy, powerful people in Japan lived in those styles of homes. They fell in love with it. They asked Junso to make them a home to display at the MoMA, and he did. He actually, believe it or not, built it in Japan with a group of craftsmen. Built it in Nagoya, Japan, which is a bit south of Tokyo. They completed it in 1953, and they began the process of taking it all apart again and shipping it to New York City to showcase at the MoMA. Here we see Junzo in a field of crates and boxes at the courtyard at the MoMA right before they begin to reconstruct Shofuso in New York City. So yeah, believe it or not, they built it in Japan. I guess because all the materials were there, and all the craftsmen who knew the traditional kind of ancient arts of carpentry and tiling. All of them were in Japan. They built this place with all the proper techniques, the old school techniques from the 1600s, the same materials that would have been used at that time, and so it just made sense to build it there and then ship it to New York City. And here in my next picture, we see Junzo standing proudly on top of the roof of Shifusa before it's finished, but with all the eaves and everything put in place. He's a pretty cool guy. And here we see it continuing the construction. There's a lot of people that built it in Japan, but there wasn't a whole lot of money to take all those people to New York to build it up. So it was a pretty small crew that reconstructed it. It was about six, I believe, maybe even less than that. Junzo himself, going back to this picture, even helped build it. He got on his hands and knees and carved out the little pond that was in front of the house on the veranda. He helped. He was one of the construction workers as well, even though he was supposed to just lay out the blueprints, but he was there to help too. Here we see some pictures of it being constructed, some more pictures of them putting in the final beam on top of the roof. This is sort of a very ceremonial thing where everyone gets together and puts the last beam on top of the roof, and sort of symbolizes sort of the end, almost the end of the process of building the house. Um, and here is the picture of Shifusa once it's completed. And this is part in the quality of the image taken from a newspaper clipping. So it's a little bit blurry, but I like this picture because you can see how strange this location and setting for Shifuso is. If you've ever been to Shifuso where it is now in Philadelphia, it's just night and day. It's a complete juxtaposition of this beautiful, serene little garden in this tiny courtyard surrounded by all these giant buildings in the background. Um, but that's where Shifuso was housed originally. That's where it was planned to be built. And it was brought to the MoMA and showcased in 1954. It was only supposed to stay for about 6 months, but it was incredibly popular, more so than they ever thought it would be. It was so unique. People had never seen anything like it before. It was such an attraction. It was the cool thing to do over the summer of 1954. And so they ended up canceling the other exhibitions they had planned for this space, and they let Shifuso stay for a further 6 months. It was just that popular. It was the most popular exhibit they'd ever shown at the MoMA at that time. I'm sure it's been surpassed in recent years, but at the time it saw over 250,000 people, which is crazy to think about. At Shofuso, now we see maybe going through the house and the gardens, not for our events or anything, but maybe see about 40,000 people. It's insane to think about, like quadrupling that. It's amazing, even more than that. But Shofuso needed to be taken down at some point. It stayed from 54 to 55, and they needed that space back eventually, so they took it apart again. They put it in storage, and they began looking for a place to bring it. We know they brought it to Philadelphia, as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned, for the history of that space, that area of Philadelphia and the park, but also because they wanted to keep it nearby New York. If you think about the time period, this is pretty recently after World War II and Japanese incarceration. Many people, all the Japanese Americans on the west coast of the country were sent to incarceration camps. Their property was taken away from them. A lot of them didn't have anything to go back to on the west coast. So many of them moved to New York, East Coast, big cities like Boston, New York, DC, and Philadelphia. And there really isn't, to be blunt, a lot of things out here that tie them to their Japanese culture. There's not, like there is on the West Coast, many Japanese houses, Japanese gardens. There's really not a lot like that. And they wanted to make sure that this was kept here on the East Coast within sort of driving distance from these big cities. And just so happened that Philadelphia was the perfect home for that, with that in mind, and with the history of the space in mind as well. And Shofuso too is built as an olive branch in a way. After World War II, Japan, by many Americans, was seen as still like sort of an enemy country, a country that we'd been fighting war with for many years. And Shofuso was a way to remind people of America that this was not just a country that we were fighting a war with, but Japan is a country with a beautiful history and culture, so unique, and that we can be build an olive branch, build that relationship. Japan and the U.S. now are very close, and it's partly thanks to the diplomatic relations that began immediately after World War II, and I would say Shifuso is a part of that. But it taught the American public a lot of things about Japanese culture that they wouldn't otherwise know. And the MoMA at the time was one of the biggest museums in the world, and so to have this here was an incredible opportunity for the Japanese government. So they spared no expense in building Shifuso. They spent a lot of valuable resources, time, and material and money to build this for us here. And eventually, though, it didn't, like I said, need to be brought away from MoMA and brought to Philadelphia. Here are some more pictures of it at the MoMA before we go to our next part of it being built up in Philadelphia. But you can again see the big buildings in the background, just kind of making this like beautiful contrast between the serenity of a Japanese garden. Typically in Japan, you'd see it's surrounded by forests and more trees, but here in New York, it's surrounded by buildings. I think that's pretty cool. Something pretty unique you would never even see in Japan, most likely. It's pretty rare, at least. But here is it being built again in Philadelphia. As I mentioned before, when it was brought to New York, there weren't a lot of people to build it up. When it was brought to Philadelphia, there was even less people to help put it back together. There's actually only one carpenter, the assistant carpenter, so like not even the head carpenter, sort of his assistant, was tasked in rebuilding Shifuso from the ground up, as you see in this picture here. And to help him, they hired just a bunch of union carpenters from Philadelphia who had no clue what they were doing, but they were able to follow instructions pretty well and sort of build it up like a big Lincoln log set, with the help of the assistant carpenter who helped build Shifuso originally. They built up the pond around it to create the garden as we know today. The home was completed in 57 and opened to the public in 1958. Here's a picture, not in 58, but I believe this is from the early 70s of the house in the gardens, when it was sort of first being opened to the public, and it quickly became a place where Japanese culture could thrive in Philadelphia. We had holiday celebrations, festivals, places for, there was a small Japanese population of about 3 to 4,000 people, but this was the place for them to come and celebrate their culture and their heritage, and for other people, regular Philadelphians, to come and learn about Japanese culture. The organization that I work for today, the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, was formed by a group of Japanese American people who, in the 80s, wanted to secure Shifuso after some vandalism had occurred. They put some money together, built up a fence, put a security system in, and hired people to protect the site. because they wanted to maintain this space as a place for people to come and learn about Japan and continue and carry on their culture. And so we see a nice picture here of its early days here in Philadelphia. So with all that said, that's the history. I do want to take you through and kind of give you an idea of what this place would look like if you're actually walking through it. It's a little bit hard to do that with just pictures, so I do again recommend you come out and check us out. We're open Tuesdays through Sundays, 11 to 5. That's just my little pitch. But yeah, I'll do my best with these pictures. If we're looking at this picture here again, you kind of get a full scope of the garden and see what we're looking at again from the outside, looking in. So where all these people are is where most of our visitors hang out. But if you look to the very right of this picture along that sort of back side of the house off to the side is where we're going to enter in through the house. So my next few pictures will be in that area. But here is the main entrance to Shofuso. You walk through the wooden door, the wooden gate in the back. You walk through down this little pathway. The lantern here in the middle is not the original lantern I was pointing out before. It looks like it. It's, I think, modeled after it, but it's a newer one. The hedge on the right side you see is there. It's a hornbeam hedge. It's very full in this picture, and it's full from about April to the fall. And it's there to kind of hide the garden from you as you first walk in, because the gardener wants you to see the perfect view for the first time. Not just kind of get it from the side, but they want you to see the garden for the first time in the perfect vantage point, which is actually inside the house. So you'd walk down the path towards the camera where the picture was taken, and if you turn around from where the camera is pointed here, you'll see the Genkan, the entrance to the house. All Japanese homes in Japan, I would say almost all Japanese homes in Japan, still have one of these. It's a place where you take your shoes off and enter the house. It's important for us at Shofuso, you will have to do this if you come visit. It's important for us to protect the floor and keep things clean, and to keep the wood in the house, which is I'll talk about that in a little bit, keep it from getting stained or scratched. We ask you to take your shoes off. But in Japan, it's that definitely, but it's more so a mental separation of the outside world and the safety and the sort of relaxing, calming space of your home. So just like many of us do, we take off our shoes when we get home, we sort of sit down and relax. In Japan, that's sort of like a regimented thing that you do. You take your shoes off and you sort of walk into your home, and you forget about the troubles of the outside world. You're supposed to forget about the stresses of your job or wherever you came from, and just relax because it's your home. So many homes still in Japan have this genkan. It looks a bit different because most people don't have 100 people walking through their home at one time as we do, but a little bit smaller for most cases. What most homes in Japan today do not have is this next item here, a shikidai. This, again, Shofuso is a home for nobility, for very high-ranking people in the government, military, Buddhist community. But let's use the example of an emperor. In this particular part of Shofuso, it does not exist anymore because really the separation of the social structure isn't as rigid as it is today, as it was back then. But this is to sort of physically separate the emperor, who would sit on the matted part on top of the staircase and greet, for the most part, messengers would come and deliver messages on foot. They would sit at the bottom of the staircase, and the emperor, in this example, would sit at the top and receive the message, physically having been separated from the messenger, sort of just to remind them that you're speaking to someone much higher above you in social standing. I didn't mention this before, I probably should have, but Shofuso was actually designed after a home that was used to house emperors, high-ranking samurai, Buddhist monks, very important people in Japan, specifically as a guest home for them to stay in while they were visiting a very famous Buddhist temple outside of Kyoto. That home that Shofuso is based on, it's not a one-for-one copy, but it's based on it. It's called Kojo-in. It was built in 1601. It's still standing. It's if you're there, it's eerily similar to Shofuso, but Shofuso is a bit smaller, and some things are different. This was never lived in. It was always a museum piece. So they built things a little bit differently. And they also showcase different styles of architecture and different styles of gardens to showcase not just one style, but to give you a sort of broader view of what um, not just the nobility were living in Japan in the 1600s, but other people as well. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I just wanted to point that out before we go any further. Here we are walking down the hallway towards the garden. You're sort of starting to see the garden for the first time, just a glimpse of it. Off to the right, we have an exhibit that's still ongoing at Shofuso. I don't have time to talk about it today, but it's about the people that came together in the 80s and formed the organization that I work for to protect Shofuso. We have a website about it, and you can come to Shofuso to learn more. But unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it, so we're going to keep walking and check out our beautiful viewing garden. Um, Shofuso, like I said, was designed after a home that would house important people. And to showcase their importance, oftentimes homes of wealthy members of the nobility would have beautiful, lush gardens that were almost like beautiful 3D paintings. Land was also very expensive in Japan, so to have this much land devoted to just something that's pretty and not functional is a sign of sort of wealth and power. You don't need it for farming or anything like that. You use it to look out and appreciate nature, this idyllic version of nature. And this is, as it says here in the slide, a viewing garden. It is, like I was saying, basically a 3D painting. You look at it from the veranda, from inside the house. That is the vantage point that the gardener who built it wanted you to look at it. Because again, that's where the important wealthy person was mostly spending a lot of their time. It was inside the house or on the veranda, so they wanted to tailor that view towards them. So we're getting a bit of that glancing view of the garden. You can see all the sort of the center dry waterfall here, and the azalea bushes along the side and the big trees in the backdrop. So this is sort of the perfect vantage point for this viewing garden. These are also known as hill and pond gardens for the hills off to the right side of the picture here. They're small, but they're like little rolling hills, and of course the pond in the middle. Here's another picture of the garden from a different vantage point. Sort of kind of turning the camera to the left here so you can see the other half of the garden with our island and the red pine on the island. And this is pretty much what Shofuso looks like right now. I took these pictures just last week to kind of give you a snapshot of Shofuso right now here in the sort of middle part of May. But yeah, this garden was built up with Shofuso when it was first brought here, and is perfectly fit really with the house. The house without the gardens would sort of be out of place, and same with the gardens without the house. They're built in tandem, they're built together, they're sort of inseparable, in at least if you ask a Japanese architect or a Japanese gardener. Just checking my time, I have about 15 more minutes, so I think we're good. Of course, my favorite part about the garden is the koi fish that we have. That's many people's favorite as well, I won't deny it. We have about 35 koi fish in our pond. They are award-winning koi, or so I'm told. We have on our board of directors a koi fish breeder here in America who's won a bunch of awards and is renowned even in Japan for breeding koi fish. And thankfully, he donates them to us because if we had to buy them, we'd be bankrupt. These koi fish can go upwards of $20,000. The ones we have, even I've seen recently, even in Japan, that at auction some koi fish go for $2 million. I think that is the highest one that was ever sold. Some of them in the $1 million range. They can be very, very expensive. You may be asking yourself why. Koi fish are sort of bred like dogs. So they are bred for their color and their size, the shininess of their scales. There are some color configurations that are very, very highly sought after. So you're really, if you're buying a koi fish, you're buying it for like its DNA to continue breeding it and to carry on the lineage of that fish. Um, we're not so worried about that. We just like have fish in our pond to have our guests feed them and enjoy them. We do sell koi food, fish food. So if you're ever at Chifuso, please do that because it's a lot of fun. They're always hungry. They come up to you in like a big swarm. They're very impressive to look at. They're pretty big. Some of them are like you might not be able to see, but very big, like mini sharks almost. It's pretty cool. They're just a variety of carp that's just very colorful. Koi fish are a symbolic. They have symbolic meaning, I should say, in Japan. They are very hardy fish. The fish that we have stay in the pond over winter and they hibernate, so they can withstand a lot. Temperature change, flooding, lots of things happen in our pond. Different levels of chemicals in the pond, whatever. Koi fish are pretty hardy. They're also seen as like hardworking because they always swim upstream and they kind of continue swimming even if it gets really shallow or the current gets really high. Um, They're the symbol of the holiday that's going on right now, actually, Children's Day, which happens in early May. There's if you don't mind, I'm going to switch back to this picture here. If you see on the top right, there's a big flagpole with some. It's kind of hard to tell because the wind wasn't blowing that day, but those are koi kites. You might see them around smaller versions. But for Children's Day, the parents have a koi fish flag for each member of the family to sort of represent that they want them to have a long life because koi fish can live on average about 60 years, and they want them to be hardworking. So koi fish have a lot of meaning in Japan, but specifically that good luck, long life, and to be hardworking. Now, moving on to the wood of the house, it's a very special part of the house, and it maybe sounds kind of boring to talk about wood, but trust me, it is a very important part of the house. And goes back to what I was saying before. They spared no expense in building this house because the wood that's comprising the house, the entirety of the house, the floor, the doors, the beams, the support beams, the ceiling, the roof, is all made out of hinoki wood, which is a type of cypress that's only grown in Japan. Hinoki has very interesting properties. You can see in my picture it's not the best quality, but you can still tell there's no paint, there's no varnish, there's no chemical to protect the wood. The wood itself is all pretty much weatherproof. It does not get rotted away with rain, does not get actually attacked by insects. It's pretty incredible. But for hinoki to be used as lumber to build, it needs to grow for 200 years to reach full maturity, and only then can it be chopped down to use to build homes like this. But because of those important properties that can leave it to be out in the open and be fine in the weather, it's been used to construct the most important temples and shrines and homes in Japan for, I would dare say, over 1,000 years. It's been around for a very long time as a sort of main uh, construction piece of all homes and important buildings in Japan. Wood has been used as the main material to build homes out of because there's no nails really that build or that are used to build Japanese homes. It's all wood joinery. It's all essentially built together like a big puzzle. And that's because earthquakes are really prevalent in Japan, and to allow those pieces of wood to just sit in with one another and move, it allows it to kind of sway with the movement of the earth instead of resist against it, which is what would happen if it was built out of more rigid materials. So all homes in Japan for a very long time were built out of wood, and the important ones were built out of hinoki wood. So they were building this home in the early 1950s with hinoki wood after it had become an endangered species. It's very limited supply. Again, it takes so long to grow that they want to make sure there's enough to rebuild and repair those old buildings that still exist in Japan. So they actually got permission from the government to use hinoki wood to build Shofuso as it would have been back in the day, which is pretty incredible. And one of these smaller planks that we're looking at here, which we're pretty much seeing the entirety of the plank, there's maybe like 4 or 5 inches at the bottom of the picture that aren't shown. One of these planks would cost nowadays probably over $1,500, and the whole house is comprised of this wood. So it's hard to really put a price tag on it, but it's just suffice to say very expensive for this home to have been built back then. Not only were the floors and everything else built with hinoki, but the roof is also comprised of hinoki bark, the outer part of the tree that is shaved off and put in very small shingles. This is the traditional way these homes were built. It has a weight that keeps the house in place during earthquakes, so it kind of presses it down into the earth, but the important structural beams, they can still move and wiggle underneath the weight of the roof. But there's a cross section, a close up of it. The hinoki bark itself is very expensive, of course, and this is the only structure outside of Japan that uses hinoki bark roof. So it does need to be repaired every once in a while, which I think is my next picture. Yes. So the last time we did a full repair was 1999, which is what we're looking at here. And the full cost of that was about $1.2 million to get the materials that are very expensive from the hinoki tree. And there's only less than 100 people in Japan even that know how to build these kinds of structures. And this is the only one outside of Japan, so they had to fly all the way out here and rebuild. Every single piece of hinoki gets taken out and replaced. It's a very long, about 2 months process, working every day. It's pretty cool though, and it's unique that we have this here in America. It's something that I think really sets the house apart from other counterparts, even in California, and where these are a little bit more prevalent. This is sort of what stands out in making us unique and authentic and almost straight out of a time machine from the early 1600s. So let's move into the actual rooms. And I know I'm a bit running out of time, so I'll try to make these quick. But I do want to showcase what we're actually looking at and how people would have lived in Japan. So we're looking at the main living space, a 15 mat room, because there are 15 tatami mats in this room. Tatami mats, which you can see on the floor, are all one size. They're about 6 feet by like 2.5 feet. They're seen as the unit of measurement that one person could fit in and live comfortably, whether that's sleeping or sitting and eating or something else. It was sort of seen that one person could fit in one of these mats pretty comfortably. So they became sort of a unit of measurement. That's what we use it for, 15 mat room, because there's 15 mats in it. This is where that important, let's say, emperor again would stay and spend almost all of their time. You can see there's no real furniture that's left out. We have some decorations in the back there, but there's no bed, there's no cabinet, there's no, of course, no TV or anything. Um, Everything that was used for furniture was brought in as it was needed and taken out as it wasn't. So it's very multifunctional. At night, you'd have your bedroll laid out, and then in the morning, it would be rolled back up and put in storage. So these rooms are very multifunctional and very open spaces. It's hard to gauge the size there, but if you look off to the right, you can see a wedding kimono. So it's about the size of a person there. You can kind of get the sense for the scale of everything. And what we do have is some furniture that's built in. It's kind of hard to call them furniture, but the most important one and the most important piece of furniture in the whole house is this right here, the showy, that part off to the left there. It's right in the focal point, the main center point of the room. And this gives its name to the architectural style of Shofuso. I mentioned it a long time ago in passing. It's called Shoin Zukuri, which means desk-centered style. This is, believe it or not, it's really low to the ground, but it's a desk. You'd be sitting on the floor, and as the emperor, or again, maybe a samurai, you would need to know how to read and write as a part of a member of the nobility. You might be writing contracts or sending letters of war, I don't know, but you would need to know how to read and write. And this is a functional piece of your home that we'd use every day. What it also is a sign of wealth and power that, oh, I know how to read and write. I've come from a wealthy, powerful family, and this is, you know, uh, my skill that I have and maybe 1% of people also have. So to have this built into your home is also a subtle way of saying, I'm smart, I'm intelligent, I'm cultured, and I have, a lot of money. To sum it all up. Moving on from the main room, we also have a different style of garden here, the roji, which is the tea garden. Because the next part in our tour is the tea house. A tea garden is the physical walk through that you would make as a guest for a tea. So different from the viewing garden, you'd actually be walking through here. You see it's a little bit more dark. There's a little more overhang of the trees. Roji literally means dewy path because it's usually very dark and mossy and kind of like, dewy, a little bit wet. In the right picture, we have a lantern there and a basin to wash your hands and your mouth before you go into the tea to kind of purify yourself and cleanse yourself. And the entrance to the tea house is right here. The only thing I want to mention about this is that traditionally these doors are only about half that height, about 2.5 feet tall. You have to crawl through, which means you'd have to bow to everyone inside the tea house, putting you on sort of a level playing field with everyone else that you're having tea with. But it also means is that you can't bring any weaponry in with you. Katana are very large swords that wouldn't fit through these very small doors. So the tea house is sort of a mandatory safe space. You could go in there, you wouldn't talk about anything but tea. It was a relaxing space, a meditative space, no arguments, no weapons. It was a place for people to come together, especially at a time when tea was first sort of derived in the mid 1500s, a very tumultuous, war torn time in Japan. So the tea was a place that people could come together and feel safe. And we're going to look inside the tea house really briefly here. This is the tea house mizuya, the water room, as it's translated to. This is where the host would be in cleaning the bowls, getting everything ready and prepared for their guests in the other room. The guests would never be in this room. They would not come in through this way, as I showed you in the past picture. They would come in through the guest entrance on in the other room, which is right off to where the camera is facing, right off to the right, which we're going to enter right now. And through that door is where we just walked through for pretending we're going through Shofuso. But that is where the host would come out. They would sit right in front of that door, off to the side a little bit, and serve tea from that area. And the guests would line up along this back part of the wall where the camera is. The first part, the first thing that you would do as a guest for one of these tea gatherings is go up to this little alcove here. and sit and sort of think about the scroll and the flower arrangement. The host of a tea would pick out each of those elements, and for each of their tea gatherings, usually it would have something. The scroll would say something seasonal like spring, azalea, cherry blossom, something like that, and the flower would have one of those flowers in it most likely. But that would be your first place to kind of sit and clear your mind and get ready for a very meditative, relaxing experience. Tea is all about meditation. It comes from Buddhist monks using matcha, the caffeine in matcha, to stay awake during meditation. And so that history is sort of carried on with a very, it's secular, it's not Buddhist related anymore, but does have its roots in Buddhism. But it is a very meditative experience. And so they built these tea houses, as we can see. They're very, it's hard to get the scale for it, but it's a very small space. There's only 4 tatami mats as opposed to the other room, which had 15. So only 4 people can really fit in here comfortably, according to the tatami mat rule. But it is a very small space to kind of make it intimate, to make it enjoyable, and not make anyone feel awkward to talk to if you're too far away and maybe kind of hard to talk loudly. In this small room, you should feel comfortable and able to communicate with the people that you're having tea with. So it's all about that sort of comfort, relaxation. It's also a very natural looking space. The walls are green. The pillars that hold up the space are uncarved wood. The ceiling that we see here is a woven sort of patchwork ceiling that is a very common farmhouse style ceiling. So it's a very like rustic, simplistic style of architecture called chashitsu, which is the word I have off to the left there. So this is a different style of architecture than the main house, and so is the bathhouse, which you see in the back of this picture. We have the Subo Niwa, though. This is the third type of garden, the viewing garden, tea garden, and then this Subo Niwa means container garden. It is, you often see it in the middle of a building, in a courtyard, a very small, maybe outdoor section between houses or between 2 different buildings. These are often very small gardens. You see often ferns, moss, because they don't get a lot of sunlight in these gardens as well. This is a pretty big version of one of them. You can look up pictures of Subo Niwa, and they're usually probably half this size, I would say, but still have the main elements that you need for a Japanese garden: plants, rocks, and water. So we have a stream cutting through the middle there. What oftentimes you see is a basin that we see in sort of the center back of the picture. And we also have the rain chains that are right in the foreground, that chain that runs down through the middle of the picture. That is a downspout for a gutter system. And when it rains, it makes a beautiful waterfall sound. So there's creative ways to add water to your garden if you don't have just a natural stream cutting through. What we have in the back of this picture is the entrance to the bathhouse. So this is a very common bathhouse you'd see in Japan, a very standard wooden tub, and baths were not super common or every day for normal people in Japan, the regular farmers and people like that. But for the nobility, it was an everyday occurrence. They would heat up one batch of water, and the whole family would bathe in the same water throughout the day. But really, you would clean yourself on the outside first with a bucket of water and kind of wash yourself off. And the tub that we see in this picture is really just for relaxation. It's like a hot tub. And many people know about onsen in Japan that are natural hot springs. This is sort of a home version of an onsen. And on the other side to the left where this picture was taken are the toilets. We have a squat toilet and a urinal. So very old school, very simplistic, again from the 1600s, but just sort of fancy holes in the ground, still lacquered wood, so it still looks kind of fancy. It's a little bit more upscale than most people in Japan at the time, but just very simple, toiletry, just holes in the ground. And Yeah, moving on from that, we have our last room in on the tour before I open it up to some questions. I know I said a lot of information here, but hopefully people put some questions in the chat and I'll answer those after this. But I do want to bring this up before we end. This is sort of the last room that we go through on the tour because it really brings a lot of things together. This is the Minka style architecture that we have at Shofuso. Minka means of the people. Junzo Yoshimura, the architect, and his craftsmen wanted to include this style of home because they didn't want everyone thinking that Japan was just all these beautiful big houses. Of course there are farmers and fishermen that live in rural parts of Japan too, and this is what they lived in. Very simplistic. There's as we see in this picture, an oven that's separated from the wood. You don't want your wood being too close to any heat source. In a home like this, made of wood and paper and straw, you always have to be careful of your heat sources. So the stove is on the ground here, which is usually just dirt, But in our case, it's cement, and separate on the sort of lower down area. There's stairs that take you down to the cement there. And it's a Minka is a style of architecture that's very fluid. It does not have specific blueprints or layouts like the Shoin-zukuri main 15 mat room style that I showcased earlier. It's really just whatever is functional and makes the most sense for a family living in whatever area they live in. So if you live in the north, your home is of course going to have a lot less open doors and ventilation, which you can see at the very top of the picture there. Those open slats that lead outside for ventilation. Probably going to have less of those in the north where it's very cold. In the south, it's going to look more like this with open doors to allow wind flow. And typically, these homes have thatch roofing, so just reeds and straw and things like that put on the roof. That requires a lot of maintenance and rotation and making sure it's upkept and replacing it all the time. So unfortunately, we don't have a traditional thatch roof, but those are common. There are some in Japan that still do have those thatch roofs, and if you go to Japan, it's cool to check them out. But this is a pretty standard Minka, pretty simple. And this room right here, and I'm going to show you the next picture, is right behind again where the camera was before. It's just the other side. So pretty simple to orient yourself. It's a very small room, and this is pretty much the entire space of one family where they would live. There'd usually be a smaller, maybe format room off to the side for them to sleep, but this is the rest of the house. This that we're looking at in this picture is a tansu. It's a cabinet where things are placed. Pretty much everything that the family needs to store goes in this tansu. Families would pass them down from generation to generation. They were a very important part of the family. Pretty much everything that they had, that they owned, would go inside one of these tansu. And the reason that they built it is because of that, the importance that these families would have put into their tanzu. Um, that's why that they built this tanzu in Japan when they built Shofuso. It's the only piece of furniture that they built with Shofuso, but they knew that its importance to this type of family that would have lived in a Minka style home. So they built a tanzu. Right now, it's used to house the vases for our flower arrangements and things like that. We have Ikebana flower arrangers come every single week to replace the flowers and make new arrangements. So they leave all their equipment in there for now. But traditionally, you'd see things like food being stored in there, kitchen equipment, maybe even farming equipment, and the futon bed rolls would get rolled up in there as well. So that's it. That's the last room in the house. Those three architectural styles we saw, again, we're showing Zukuri, the 15 mat room style, the tea house style, which is Chashitsu style, and then the Minka style, which is the sort of rural farmhouse style of architecture. And then we saw three types of gardens: the viewing garden, the Roji garden, the tea garden, and the Subo Niwa courtyard garden. And all that comes together to make a really unique space. Shifuso is like nothing else, even in Japan. But we have a lot of people come from Japan and who have lived there for most of their lives and say it's almost like it's just taken a chunk out of Japan and brought it here to Philadelphia. So if you, I do encourage you to go to Japan, but if you can't afford the $2,000 plane ticket or whatever it might be, we have a really unique space right here in Philadelphia that's only about 45 minutes away, for most of you guys to experience Japan, learn a little bit about it, and get to sort of see and feel what it's like. There is really a unique atmosphere at Chifuso. If you come and you just kind of sit there, you sort of feel this like presence, and it's a really relaxing experience just to be there and sort of meditate and clear your mind for a little bit and sit on the veranda and look at the garden. It's a really beautiful space. So I do again encourage you to come out and experience it, but I will open us up to some Q&A. I'm a little later than I thought, but I do want to get to as many questions as I can. So feel free to hit me up with any questions you had. I know it was a lot of information, but
So,
let me
Mike,
just go
it's
back.
Anna here. There are some questions
Um,
there in the chat, but before we started, I wanted to tell you that I think you sold yourself short because you were saying, "Oh, it's a PowerPoint, it's not the same thing," but your excitement about the authenticity and the integrity of the structure itself, it was palpable. It just came through the
Thank you.
presentation. And so that really did, it was just so much
Awesome.
information, but just fabulously presented.
Thank
So
you.
there
Yeah,
are
it's a
a
cool
few
place.
questions there. Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can tell you were a tour guide at one point.
Yeah, I can't get it out of my system. It's just part
Well,
of me.
it
But
was
yeah,
it was a very natural dialogue.
great.
So someone asked, and this is when you were talking about the ancient temple in the beginning, how the
Sure.
Japanese felt about their ancient temple gate being removed and brought to Philadelphia.
There is a lot of history around the Neomon that is really obscured. Unfortunately, like most of the history, we don't even know for certain if the date that it was built is actually accurate. Some people say it's from the 1600s, some people say it's from the 1300s. And I think a lot of the primary sources are in Japanese, and unfortunately, I don't speak Japanese. I wish I did. I've tried, but the I guess to answer the question, the something I didn't mention about the Neomon Gate was that it was actually displayed at the World's Fair in St. Louis at the time. That's how these people from Philadelphia even heard of it in the first place. So it was, as far as I understand, the gate itself was kind of traveling around, being showcased at different places. And at the time that these two Philadelphians um, saw it, it was in St. Louis at the World's Fair. So it wasn't being used at the time. Clearly, it was sort of on a traveling exhibit in a
Okay.
way. So it wasn't like it was an essential, still functional part of this temple. But yeah, I'm not sure how the what the sentiment was. I think Japan at that time was really concerned about being a world leader, a power throughout the world, and in that way, I think they were really happy to share their culture and spread it. Like I said, after they opened up to the outside world in the mid 1850s, they took it upon themselves to learn as much as they could and be a part of the world stage on the world stage. So I think for them, I can't speak, of course, for them, but I think in a way they did see it as an honor that it would be seen as this really important artifact and to be placed in such an area that had so much history going back to 1876. Again, I can't speak for them, but I think it wasn't maybe as like culturally appropriating as it might seem at first. Some of the stuff that happens in the early 1900s, some rich people that make their gardens, sometimes I do see that as a little bit of that, but in this case, not so much. Yeah, good question though.
And then someone asked, in past centuries, were women allowed to have tea in the tea rooms, or were they only for men?
That's another good question and maybe another contentious question, but it was strictly for men at the beginning. I could go on and on about tea. That's my like personal favorite thing to talk about and something I'm really interested in. I don't have enough time to talk about it here, but to go over it briefly, tea was started as it goes way back to the Buddhist monks using it for meditation, and in that way, Buddhist monks were men, and it sort of evolved over time to have a lot of the same elements of what we know now as cha do, which is the way of tea, takes a lot of its ideas from Buddhism. It was founded in the early to mid 1500s by a group of Buddhist practitioners and samurai. And for hundreds of years, it was a sort of a practice that was really only for samurai. Not until I don't know the exact date, but I would say that at least the 20th century, it was pretty much kept away from, insulated towards male samurai culture, and it was seen as a very manly thing to do that women weren't really invited in. But nowadays, we see it, of course, as open to anyone. And in the mid 1950s, after World War II, tea was a way to bring people together. Again, it's a meditative experience. People can make tea for each other, sort of altruistic. After World War II, tea was sort of like the way that Japanese people, it was like diplomacy for them through tea. And so many women started picking it up and, showcasing kimono and like the beautiful dress. So it's sort of like a 1-2 punch combination. But for many years at its start, it was only men, to answer your question in a long winded way. But
No, it's interesting. And do you do tea ceremonies in that you said it was a four mat tea room, is that right?
we do. Yes, we do. But we do tea demonstrations every month. They're pretty traditional. There's three main tea schools. We work with two of them because one's really only in Japan. We work with Urasenke, who has a chapter here in Philadelphia, and Amoto Senke, who have a chapter in near you guys actually, Princeton and New York City. And so the next one we have coming up is on May 25th. It's actually there's two different types. So in the main 15 mat room, we'll have a larger gathering of about 20 people for what's called thin tea or usucha, which is a more common type of matcha. But for a more special, like special occasion, it's called koicha, which is a thick, almost like it's a really thick. I don't want to say like sludgy because it makes it sound gross, but it's a very thick, like soupy sort of consistency. It's a lot more matcha to water. It's a very special occasion kind of drink, and we have that in the format room. So the tea house is still used, that little tiny room. But we only sell about 4 tickets for it, so it's got to be for special occasions. Yeah. But if you're interested, we have tickets on our website. Please come and join us for that. It is a really, really cool experience on May 25th.
And I did have someone ask where Shofusu was, and I put in the chat, I put
Oh,
the link, the
great.
japanphilly.org /Shofusu, and it's in Fairmount Park, basically, right? In that
Hmm.
area.
It,
Okay.
yeah, it's hard because we don't have an exact address. We're just a part of the park. We oftentimes just tell people to look up Shifuso on GPS, like Google Maps or Apple Maps. But we are right in Fairmount Park. If you've ever been to the Please Touch Museum, I was saying this to Anna before, it's right behind the Please Touch Museum. The Please Touch Museum is in Memorial Hall, that big main part of the centennial celebration that I said. So Shifuso is right nearby. Yeah, it's right in. If you go to japanphilly.org, you can find out all that information. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
right in. It's West Philadelphia. It's in Fairmount Park. Fairmount Park's pretty big, but it's in West Philadelphia.
I will send out the link also to the participants
Great.
and the registrants who are here, just so that they do have the website, as well as I'll put the address on there. And then can I ask one more question? Because I'm kind of
Sure.
interested in this as well. When you were showing the different rooms, you did show the storage at the end. And I think at the desk, there were kind of drawers that were
Hmm.
there. But someone was
Yeah,
asking, where did they keep their clothing? Because there
that's a
really
great
wasn't. It
question.
looked
Well,
like there was a lot.
it depends on how much property you own, because sometimes there would be a separate whole building for storage of things like that, for clothing, for your valuables, for valuable items. It goes back to particularly when like I was saying before, you always have to be careful with fire in these homes, and sometimes that does happen actually quite often. A lot of famous important temples are like on their fourth or fifth iteration because they've been burnt down. um, so in case that does happen, they have a whole separate building for all their valuables to be placed. They don't lose everything. But in Shifuso and in some cases in Japan too, we have a storage hallway that actually sits behind um, the 15 mat room. The big murals there open up to a storage hallway where a lot of things would have been stored. There's another smaller room off to the side of that. There's little areas to store things. Again, most things are small and movable, so you don't need to have a whole like storage unit of things for the most part. But we do have storage inside the house, and I'd say most commonly, especially nowadays, these structures have storage inside. But you do see the separate buildings sometimes on a big kind of larger plot of land that they would have all their valuables. I guess it's just the level of famous and wealthy you are. You have more more important valuable things. I'm not sure.
Well, Mike, once again, I do want to thank you. It was such an amazingly educational talk, and I think you've whet everybody's appetite to come out and visit. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know this is a busy time of year for you. I want to thank Kim, who was behind the scenes, making sure everything was running smoothly this evening. And again, thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. Mike, it was absolutely a pleasure working with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. It was great talking with you all. And yeah, please do come to Shofuso. It's beautiful all year round. So if you miss it in the spring, please do come whenever you feel like it.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much,
thank
Mike.
you,
I'll be in
everyone.
touch, okay?
That sounds good.
All right,
Bye,
bye
everyone.
now.